Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are in Lesson 15 of the Gospel of Luke, and we're covering Luke chapter 5, verses 33 through 39, and Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. This one's called Grace and the Law. Jesus often taught using parables, and we have reached the first parable in Luke. Parables typically were everyday stories meant to reveal spiritual truths. For us, some of these stories can leave us a bit perplexed. Part of the reason is that the context of the parables is not the same in our culture. Another part of this is that Jesus did not intend for everyone to understand his messages. Isaiah prophetically stated this in Isaiah 6, verses 9 through 10. And he said, "Go and tell this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull, and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return and be healed." Often when the disciples and Jesus were away from the crowds, the disciples asked questions, and Jesus explained what they'd misunderstood. Let's read our first passage today. Luke chapter 5, verses 33 through 39 says this. Then they said to him, "Why do the disciples of John fast often and make prayers? And likewise those of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink." And he said to them, "Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. Then they will fast in those days." Then he spoke a parable to them. "No one puts a piece from a new garment on an old one. Otherwise the new makes a tear, and also the piece that was taken out of the new does not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine will burst the wineskins and be spilled, and the wineskins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins, and both are preserved. And no one, having drunk old wine, immediately desires new, for he says, the old is better." There's a balance in the human body between the physical and the spiritual, between the flesh and the spirit. As Christians, we cannot please God when we are walking in the flesh. Galatians reminds us that if we walk in the Spirit, we will not fulfill the lusts of the flesh. Walking in the flesh involves carnal lusts, and Jesus emphasized that our lusts are just as sinful as our physical sins. Anger is no different than murder, and sexual lust is no different than adultery. Knowing this, we learn more about ourselves, as well as more about Jesus. By internalizing these words from Jesus, we realize that we sin even more than we previously thought. But the emphasis from Jesus reminds us that what is on the inside will move to the outside. We also learn that the sinlessness of Jesus reveals that he never sinned, even by intent, by thought, or by desire. The first parable in Luke begins with a question by the Pharisees concerning fasting. Why do the Pharisees fast, and the disciples of John the Baptist fast, but the disciples of Jesus do not fast? By referring to the bridegroom, Jesus answered their question. But as the Pharisees likely did not understand that terminology, it is doubtful their understanding changed at all. Jesus was speaking of himself. When believers are reunited with Jesus in heaven, we will all celebrate together at the wedding feast of the Lamb. We will be the brides of Christ, and Jesus is the bridegroom. In Ephesians 5, Paul encourages husbands to love their wives like Christ loves the church. That is sacrificially, a love so strong that Jesus was willing to die for us. But because Jesus was with the disciples, it was a time of celebration, not a time of fasting, nor a time of mourning. there would be a time for fasting after Jesus returned to heaven. In his explanation, Jesus began with a parable that showed that it was not useful to patch an old garment with a new piece of cloth. Anytime we see Jesus referring to the old and the new, it should alert us into comparing the differences between the law and grace. Through the law, God gave mankind a way to deal with sin. And without dealing with sin, we cannot have fellowship with God. Through the law and the sacrificial system, man could be forgiven for sin by the spilling of innocent blood. The law did not fail, but following the law was burdensome to the people. Jesus came to fulfill the law, and this pointed to his own death on the cross. One death which would be sufficient to cover all sin. As believers, because of the death of Jesus, we are clothed in his righteousness. Instead of patching a hole in the old garment, with that old garment being the law, Jesus has clothed us with an entirely new garment. We are covered in his righteousness, covered by the blood of the Lamb. Though our sins were as scarlet, we are now white as snow. Jesus also explains this same situation by explaining that we cannot put new wine in old wineskins. The new wine will cause the old wineskins to burst. New wine must be placed in new wineskins. There's nothing wrong with the old wine that remains in the old wineskins. The gospel is the new wine, and grace is the new wineskin. The gospel must be placed in grace, not in the law. Of course, Jesus was replying to the Pharisees, but was speaking to all of us. The Pharisees did not understand the answer by Jesus, but they were still in love with the law. In fact, as we know, they were so legalistic that they had lost complete sight of the purpose of following the law. Obedience to God is our way of demonstrating our love for him. And because he loved us first, our obedience is the proper response. But the Pharisees removed God from the process. They loved the law and largely ignored the God who gave the law to the Jewish people. With the Son of God standing in front of them, the Pharisees kept looking for ways to kill Jesus, ways to reveal him as a false prophet. But the gospel of Jesus had caused their old wineskins to burst. Let's read the next passage. Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5 says this. Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" But Jesus answering them said, "Have you not even read this? What David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those with him, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he said to them, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." The continuous words and questions of the Pharisees reveal to us the advantage of grace in comparison to the law. Just as the Pharisees followed Jesus and nitpicked every aspect of the life of Jesus, the Jewish religious authorities habitually did the same with all Jewish people. It is easy to see how the law had become burdensome for the people to follow. There were 613 different commandments by God in the Old Testament law, given to the Jewish people. But that was not enough for the Jewish religious authorities. They created additional laws to make sure that the Jewish people never approached the line of God's law. Think of a border between two nations, and the laws created by the Pharisees placed a second border 50 miles from the actual border. Along with these additional laws, though, the Pharisees were much less likely to follow their own laws. One example is when the Pharisees brought a woman caught in the very act of adultery to Jesus and asked Jesus if she should be stoned based on the law. As we all know, if she was caught in the act of adultery, she was not alone. Where was the man who also had been caught in the very act with her? The Pharisees selectively enforced the law. In the same manner, they were picking and choosing the laws they would try to enforce upon Jesus. The Pharisees complained that the disciples of Jesus had plucked the heads of grain and ate them as they walked through a field on the Sabbath. The disciples did not do this as an act of labor, but as an act of hunger. To the Pharisees, this was exactly the same as ignoring the Sabbath, ignoring that they were not to do work on the Sabbath, and this behavior by the disciples was no different to the Pharisees than a farmer who toiled 7 days a week in the fields all day, every day. I've mentioned this before, but this legalistic behavior still exists today. During my 2-week trip to Israel, we stayed in large hotels, and at sundown on Friday, the elevators became Shabbat elevators. If there were 8 floors in the hotel, the elevator would stop at every floor, going up and going down, to ensure that those riding the elevator did not work on the Sabbath by pushing a button. It took a long time to leave the hotel on those days. In Matthew 12, Jesus explained by using an example of a sheep that falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Leaving the sheep in the pit until the next day might lead to the death of the sheep, and it would not demonstrate compassion in any way. Who would do that? The Pharisees exuded a complete lack of compassion and a complete misrepresentation of the attributes of the God they claim to serve. Let's read our last passage today. Luke chapter 6, verses 6 through 11 says this: Now it happened on another Sabbath also, that he entered the synagogue and taught, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts, and said to the man who had the withered hand, Arise and stand here. And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? And when he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. It sounds like the scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees followed Jesus around everywhere he went. Instead of being blessed by hearing him and learning from him, they were just acting as spies. After reporting back to their superiors, they would plot how to kill Jesus. The scribes and Pharisees watched him closely. They watched him not to be amazed by his knowledge of the Old Testament, not to learn the depth of God's word, simply to see if he healed on the Sabbath. Of course, Jesus saw inside their hearts and knew exactly what they were there to see, so he made sure that he healed the man with the withered right hand that day in front of them. Plucking the head of wheat qualified as work to the Pharisees. Simply telling a man to stretch out his hand was work to them as well. As the Pharisees could not heal anyone, how could they attribute the words of Jesus telling a man that he had healed the man to work? The Pharisees had to think Jesus was responsible for the healing. But as Jesus only spoke, and they were also speaking, how were their words not work too? And I guess following Jesus everywhere he went on the Sabbath and reporting back to the higher-ranking Pharisees was not doing work on the Sabbath either. It is interesting that I'm doing this study on Sunday, on the Sabbath. Does not feel like work to me, because when studying the Bible, it brings me closer to Jesus. but the Pharisees would have me killed for doing a study on the Sabbath too. It all comes down to sin and our understanding of sin. The Bible defines sin, and that is a great place to start. I have an old friend who is a strong believer who says that he does not think he's sinned in about 15 years. Well, that sounds like a lie to me. I can't think of a day when I've not sinned, based on the biblical definitions of sin. God does not want us to ignore our sin, nor does he want us to live as if we have a license to sin, thinking that because Jesus will forgive us anyway, that it does not matter how often we sin. A good first step would be to understand that every single time we commit a sin, we're placing an additional burden upon the shoulders of Jesus on the cross, upon our Messiah, and if we love him, why would we do that? Again, we love God through our obedience, not by ignoring our sin. Our sin should grieve us, but Jesus came to lessen our burden. His yoke is easy, and his burden is light. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.